Our next panel is also on the national stage. Race in America's Wave of Voter Suppression. A new wave of voting laws across the United States have become law. Some of these laws restrict voting rights that predominantly affect Latinos and communities of color. It is our duty to make sure that all Latinos and people of color across the country have the opportunity to exercise their right to vote, defend their voting rights, and organize our community to protect our voting rights. To moderate this extremely important panel, please welcome back LULAC's CEO, Cindy Benavides.
Hello y bienvenidos. My name is Cindy Benavides and I serve as the Chief Executive Officer for LULAC. It is my great pleasure to welcome you back today. Today, we're going to be addressing a very important issue, in fact, that impacts the core of our democracy, our right to vote. In this panel, we're going to be addressing race in America's voter suppression and what so many experts are seeing across the country. I am thrilled and excited that we are having this discussion and that we have panelists who are absolutely change agents, folks who are understanding the beat of the community and are on the ground, really observing what's happening across our country. I'm going to quickly introduce all of our panelists and then ask them to introduce themselves. So I'm going to get started with Iracema Garza. Iracema, why don't we start with you with a quick intro?
Hello, everybody. It's very good to be here with you. I'm Iracema Garza. I'm an attorney by training. I've spent most of my life as a public servant. I've dedicated my life to advancing the rights of women and Latinos in particular, and working women. I've spent a lot of time doing that. I'm currently a independent consultant in Washington, D.C., and I represent nonprofit organizations, advising them on an array of issues. I'm here with the Leonas. The Leonas is a group that came together during the last election. There's 800 women. We joined this together within 6 weeks, helped raise $40 million for President Biden's campaign in this past election. And these Latinas are leaders from across the country. We're judges, doctors, lawyers, very concerned about what's happening in our communities today. So I'm very happy to be here on behalf of the Leonas.
Iracema, thank you so much. And thank you for being a Leona. Next, we have someone that needs no introduction, someone that I'm happy to call a friend who has been absolutely supportive in my role as one of the youngest leaders leading a national legacy organization. Derek Johnson, why don't you take a minute to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Cindy, and thank you, LULAC, for allowing me this opportunity. I'm Derek Johnson, President and CEO of the NAACP. I look forward to this discussion, but I really appreciate the partnership with LULAC. As I look across the civil rights community landscape, there is no other organization that's more similar than NAACP to LULAC. We represent the voices in communities that are living through real problems. We're not the talking heads. We have to live through the experience. So I appreciate this partnership. I look forward to figuring out more creative ways to hold systems accountable so that our communities, our families can really live the reality of the Constitution as people try to take away our opportunity to have a prosperous life. So thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Derek. And, I often say that LULAC is very similar to the NAACP. When speaking, the NAACP has a few years on LULAC, so you are a little bit older than we are, Derek. And you also have a larger board than I do. So I just thank you for your leadership and for being so active. Next, I would love to introduce Terry Almenis. And Terry, I know, is leading a lot of the voting efforts with Asian Americans Advancing Justice. Terry?
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me here today. I am Terry Almenis, Senior Director of Census and Voting Program at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. We are a national nonpartisan nonprofit located in Washington, D.C., and our mission is to advance and protect the human and civil rights of Asian Americans, and to build a fair and equitable society for all. We approach our work through many different means, whether that's community organizing, advocacy, litigation, and the like. And we work very closely with many of our partners, many of your organizations, precisely because the second part of our mission is as equally important as the first part, and that is to build a fair and equitable society for all. And voting, of course, is one of the key components of achieving that.
Muchísimas gracias, Terry. Next, we're going to welcome Steve Freeman with the Anti-Defamation League. Steve?
Thank you very much, Cindy, and thank you for the invitation. It's a real privilege for me to be part of this panel. I am the Vice President for Civil Rights at ADL. I've been at ADL for 36 years, so I've seen a lot through that time. ADL itself was founded in 1913 with a mandate to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and to secure justice and fair treatment for all. And in my role, leading our substantive legal work on a range of issues, including fighting anti-Semitism and extremism and hate online and hate crimes and so forth. A major component of what we do also is working to secure justice and fair treatment for all, and that includes advocacy on a range of issues. Fighting discrimination and voting rights is a major part of that. So I'm pleased to be part of the discussion today.
Muchísimas gracias, Steve. And just a shout out to Jonathan Greenblatt, who is a dear, dear friend, someone who is always doing collaborative work. I know that both Derek and I are part of Stop Hate for Profit. And so just really excited about the work that we're also doing online. And now it is my pleasure to welcome someone that I am happy to call my hermana, that I've known for, gosh, close to 2 decades when I first started in politics. And we both started when we were 10. So just in case you're adding the numbers, Dr. Gabriela Lemus. Gabriela, why don't you go ahead and kick it off?
Thank you so much. So I'm Gabriela Lemus. I have 2 hats today. I am the chair of the board of Mi Familia Vota Education Fund, civic engagement, voter engagement in nationally, but also with specific focus in 6 key states in the Southwest, but also in Florida. And we're expanding that. And then my other hat is as the executive director of Maryland Latinos Unidos, because as you will note from the census numbers, we are now in the double digits in the Mid-Atlantic region. And in Maryland, I would say, I was just with my chair this morning, and she was saying how, we're 30 years behind in terms of the infrastructure being built. So issues like redistricting are suddenly in Maryland for the Latino community something that is very critical. But thank you for having me, and I'm really honored to be part of this incredibly distinguished panel. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Gabriela. Well, let's jump right in. I know that so many of our LULAC members, this is a top issue for them. And, for folks that are not too familiar with LULAC, we are a membership organization. 1/3 of our members are based out of Texas. And what we all know is that there's always something happening in Texas. So many of us have multiple lawsuits currently happening in Texas. So many of us are involved at different levels, local, state, national, with this specific issue. And so I wanted to, take a step back and talk about the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And maybe I'll kick it off with you, Iracema, and then go to Gabriela and Steve, maybe join in terms of how it has supported or not supported Latinos and communities of color in the last decades, and then shift into what's happening today. So Iracema, why don't you kick it off?
Well, first of all, as everybody knows, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, really the focus was on African-American communities initially. But I don't know if people know that in 1965, the act also had a language provision because Puerto Ricanos in New York City were given literacy, almost like literacy tests, right? And so they were essentially being excluded from the ability to vote. In 1975, the language requirement again was expanded to include Mexican Americans, particularly in Texas and the Southwest, and those states that had a horrible history, particularly Texas of discrimination. And the Congress, when in reauthorizing the act that time, said the reason that Texas, that Mexicanos, Mexican Americans in Texas and the Southwest were going to be included through the language provision, it wasn't because we were unwilling. By the way, I'm Texan. I was born, grew up in Texas. All my family is from Texas. But that the reason that we were going to be included wasn't because we didn't want to learn the language or by happenstance, but rather because of the decades of discrimination that Mexican Americans had endured. And because of that, they hadn't had the opportunities to go to school and to advance in those ways. So that was one of the ways that they brought like ethnicity in. So if we look at how has it worked, let's just look at Texas over the last, since Shelby, 1 year before Shelby. Texas, as I said, one of the most discriminatory states in the country, right, was blocked from implementing the photo ID law. Then what happens once the Supreme Court decides Shelby? What does the Texas legislature do immediately hours before? Is institute an incredible number of discriminatory practices, including adding the voter ID laws. So we can see that, in fact, the VRA, the Voting Rights Act, did protect Latinos, and it is something that we desperately need as a community for it to be reauthorized.
Muchísimas gracias, Iracema. Gabriela, Steve, would you like to join in?
Well, I'll be really brief, just that I'm not a legal scholar. I have a doctorate in international relations and border studies. But I will say this as an observation. I feel that in the work that I've done, because the Voting Rights Act was in place, I have been able to do things like ensure that polling sites have bilingual materials, to Iracema's point, because of what's in the language. I've been able to work with the Civil Rights Department within the Department of Justice to be able to advance certain issues and even get DOJ civil rights leaders to different polling areas and ensure that these really critical informational pieces are in place for our communities to be able to vote and understand what is going on. I think there's been some erosion, again, as an observation, as an outsider looking into the legal system, that could potentially harm us. And I think it's part of the reason, because of that erosion, that in many of the states that we care about, like Texas, we're seeing an effort to roll back and increase voter suppression at the state legislative level.
Gracias, Gabriela. Steve?
Yeah, I would just add, Iracema mentioned the Shelby case, but it's probably worth a minute or two talking about what a devastating blow to voting rights that case was. This was a 2013 decision by the Supreme Court, which really took the core of the Voting Rights Act and basically destroyed it. They did away with the requirement that states with a history of discrimination must seek federal approval before making changes to their voting laws and practices. And the Voting Rights Act was widely regarded until then as probably the most successful of all the Civil Rights Acts. It really opened the door to, I think, a provision that underlies everything else in our democracy in terms of protecting our rights, which was the right to vote. By taking away that pre-clearance requirement, the court opened the door to all the kinds of restrictions that I'm sure we're going to be talking about more, Texas being a prime example. And so it was really a devastating blow. And that's one of the reasons why right now, getting the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act moving forward is so critical. What we're seeing at the state level, particularly in states that are hostile to voting rights or favoring voter suppression, there is not going to be, and ADL is a nonpartisan agency, as AAA, J, and the others here, there is not going to be a political ability to stop some of these laws at the state level, which is why I think we are encouraging our own supporters and others to really make a strong pitch for the John Lewis Act.
Yes.
Gracias, Steve. And I just think of Shelby and the impact that had. Also, important to note that oftentimes where we see voter suppression is where communities of color are increasing in numbers and political power specifically.
Yeah.
And so there's a direct connection to what we're seeing across the country and the impact that race has, and the impact that communities that it's having on communities of color. I'm going to shift over now to you, Derek, and to you, Terry, to talk a little bit about the impact of gerrymandering and what can be done to reverse or lessen the impact of gerrymandering in future elections. So, Terry, why don't we start with you, and then we'll shift over to Derek.
Sure. Thank you very much. I would say the first thing we can do is to make sure our communities are engaged and involved in redistricting. Maryland is my home state, so I'm excited. Gabriella started with the discussion around redistricting in Maryland. We need to be at the table. We need to be heard. Our communities need to speak up and say, we're here. This is the contours of our community. Whether or not we are at numbers large enough to actually mandate a majority minority district, right? We can still stand up and say, we are this, we are together. We are a community of interest that should be kept whole in the redistricting process. And so I think that's one way to make sure that we, are able to see districts that reflect our communities and don't crack our communities or split our communities up across different districts, where we find that elected officials oftentimes play past the buck, right? Oh, that's not my part of the district. Why don't you go talk to so-and-so? Because it's much easier to do that when you have a community that is not kept whole in one district. So the one thing, before I pass it over to President Johnson, that I just wanted to flag too, is that we also have to be mindful that in redistricting, right, there are certain legal requirements that must be adhered to, including initially the Constitution with respect to equal population, but second, compliance with the Voting Rights Act. And in the drawing of majority minority districts that are mandated by the Voting Rights Act, you may find shapes that are not perfectly square or perfectly, what people might conceive of as a pretty district. That is not what's key and critical. So I just want to, make sure that everyone's mindful of the idea that it's not the same as just looking at a map and saying like, oh, I see some funny shapes. This is clearly a problematic map, but that it really does take more investigation, more engagement with the local communities to find out what is actually happening on the ground that might be the cause for why we have shapes that are not perfect shapes. That is not the goal of redistricting, right? To develop like perfect looking maps, but to develop maps that reflect our communities and that adhere to the Voting Rights Act.
And I would make sure to add that it doesn't dilute our power, and making sure that that is reflective of that. Derek?
Sure, and Cindy, I'm going to kind of merge both questions if you don't mind. So redistricting is the process of drawing political boundary lines. And I was trained as a demographer in the late 90s with the GIS technology. And under that training, I knew instantly that you give me an outcome desired, I can almost draft maps where the resulting districts would reflect who we wanted to get elected for the policy issues that we want to promote. Knowing that political gerrymandering and racial gerrymandering merge so neatly because of racial bloc voting in so many communities, you can, quote, draw lines based on political considerations when it's really about race. And the outcome in the southeastern region of this country and now the southwestern region of the country is to maintain domination and control over the majority or the emerging demographics and populations. Yes. And so redistricting is really, really important because the map that's produced would inform whether or not communities can elect candidates of their choice for the next 10 years. We are about to walk into a scenario where the drawing of the political boundaries, whether it's utility districts, city councils, county commissioners, on up, will be done without the full protection of the Voting Rights Act. And that's a scary proposition. For the last two redistricting cycles in Texas, for example, NAACP and LULAC have always joined together in lawsuits to push back around what they were seeking to do, particularly in Texas. We're going to see that on steroids this cycle, but we won't have the protection of the courts because we won't have federal legislation in place. And when you consider the 1965 Voting Rights Act, it was not only about the African American community, it was about many communities. For African Americans, we're not a monolith, no more than the Latino community is a monolith. We have Afro-Caribbeans, we have Afro-Latinos, we have everything. So when the Voting Rights Act was passed in the debates, they used examples of what was going on in the Deep South, but they also used what was taking place in San Francisco with the Asian American community.
True.
They looked in New York and realized that the Puerto Rican community, Afro-Puerto Ricans, and other Latino populations were being locked out of the process. They went to reservations and realized that the Native Americans were being locked out and discriminated against, not only on the mainland, but also in Alaska. And so the Voting Rights Act is one of the most successful pieces of civil rights legislation, but now that it's been so diluted, we're looking at an election cycle where the political boundary lines are beginning to get drawn now, and we got an election, midterm elections. And what's truly at stake here is states like Texas. It is the big heavy in the game. You recall when California could go blue or red at any given turn. Now, California is what it is. The biggest fear now, if Texas becomes the new California, we can literally chart a course of progressive inclusion policy that look more like America than what we're seeing today. And that's why these things are so important, but greater than that, that's why having these kind of conversations across communities becomes key. So one community is not pitted against another, because at the end of the day, we're all confronted with a white supremacist mindset that would like to exploit all of us.
Derek, I just want to reiterate exactly what you said. And Cindy, thank you for having such a diverse panel. And because we may all be different, but we're all speaking the same language, and we all know where the goal is. And Derek, Texas is very, very scary. And in fact, not having the protection of the Voting Rights Act, particularly with the census numbers that just came out, is absolutely terrifying. So what do? We have to pass John Lewis, yes, to be able to get, protection for, gerrymandering, even political gerrymandering, be able to be considered by the federal courts. But what do we do as communities? It's very scary with the type of Senate that we have right now. What do we as Latinos, African Americans, Asian Americans, Jews, all communities that have been discriminated in the past, what do we do, in your opinion?
I wish I had the magic wand and say this is what we do, because if I had that perfect solution, great. I can say all of our communities, we've been picked off at the fringes.
Yep.
They're micro-targeting African American men to get them to think differently. They are trying to create a level of vocalization. The Latino community is us versus us reality. We got to move away from that.
From that, yeah.
Right? They will use foreign policy posturing to pick up many members of the Jewish community. They would try to make distinctions between the Asian American community. And at the end of the day, the powers that be are seeking to maintain status quo, because in a democracy, our votes are our currency. And if we collectively put our currency into the same bucket, we determine what democracy look like in the future. So individual communities, we must make sure they don't pick us off at the fringes. But in addition to that, they don't allow our fringes to create controversy among us.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things, very quickly, Cindy, that I wanted to say, I think that one of the things that we benefit from is to stop emphasizing differences, right?
Yes.
We're always, even among Latinos, they're not monolithic. I always think that, yes, perhaps that is true. But at the end of the day, the majority of our communities are poor, are discriminated against, don't have the same opportunity. We lack educational opportunities, et cetera, et cetera. Those are the things that I think we need to emphasize as communities so that we can stay together and strong.
Gracias for that, Iracema. And I would say that, it is absolutely a pleasure to be a part of this panel, precisely because we work with so many of the different national organizations on different issues. So, whether it's voting rights, whether it's education, whether it's access to healthcare, all these issues impact all our communities, and we can even dive into diversity, equity, and inclusion, but there's so many points where we have an intersection. And we are also reminded, to Derek's point, that even within the Hispanic ethnicity, we do have Latinos who are Black, who are Afro-Latinos, who identify in multiple ways. And we have Latino Jewish members. We also have so many families who are mixed. We have that Spaniard influence in Asia. We also, there's so much here to be able to unravel. And I know, Gabriela, gosh, we've been in conversations where it's been hours and hours of talking about history because we are both nerds. But I'm going to come back into this conversation because I want to make sure that we stay focused. And so with the next question, this is actually open to everyone. And I do want everyone to answer this because I do think from each of your perspectives, we see that there's misconceptions about our democracy and about voting. And I'm wondering what you, through your organization and your own personal lives, what you're seeing when it comes to our communities, what they're encountering at the ground level, what you're seeing as activists, and how do we combat these misconceptions, right? Because you know that perceptions can become reality, and we want to make sure that people are grounded in facts and truths in an era where there's so much and disinformation. So why don't we kick it off with you, Terry, and then we'll shift over to Steve and then Gabriela, and then we'll figure it out from there.
Sounds good. I think one of the first misconceptions that are out there, particularly when it comes to, and you've heard this in the debates and the hearings around the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act or in the lead up to the introduction, is this idea of, communities of color are voting at the same, their voter turnout, their voter registration has increased so much and there's no problem there. That is simply a lie. Yes, engagement has increased, certainly from 1965. For example, Asian Americans, for the most part, weren't allowed in the country until 1965, really opened those gates. So yes, things are different. We have seen increases, but what's really important to note is that there continues to be a differential effect when you look at voter registration and voter turnout between non-Latino whites and all the other different communities, right? For Asian Americans and Latinos, we consistently see double-digit differences with respect to both voter registration and voter turnout. A lot of that, we believe, has to do with the language issues that have been raised earlier, and these are numbers even looking at the citizen voting age population. So that already takes into account, right, that piece of it. And still we see this differential. Even with the Black community, you see that there is a continual, I think there may have been one blip, 1 year only out of all the data collected by the Census Bureau with respect to election and voter participation, only 1 year where it may have been the case that numbers were a little higher for the Black community as compared to non-Latino whites. But overall, there is still consistently a differential. And so I think we really need to push back on that line that, yes, things have improved, but we're not there yet. And that's why we need bills like the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act to be passed. And we need to both restore and reinvigorate, really, the Voting Rights Act.
Gracias, Terry. Steve?
Thanks. I actually want to go back to the last question and combine my sort of speak to both, taking a page from Derek's book. And I think also Derek was absolutely right in saying there's no magic wand. But I think what this calls for is a combination of things. It calls for basic education. It calls for advocacy. It calls for political action. It calls for legal action. It calls for all those tools, every arrow in the quiver being used in complementary ways. And our focus last year, especially in Texas, but around the country, because we have 25 offices around the country, was just to make sure people knew the basics of where to vote, how to vote, when to vote, what options were available for them. And a lot of people didn't. And that goes to misconceptions too, because there was a lot of disinformation out there about how, at mail-in ballots, there's fraud, you can't trust them, when in fact, the history shows the opposite. So I think one of the things that ADL tries to do is we try to address this issue through civil rights partnerships, through the work we did, for example, in Texas, in one case with the NAACP, working with the Brennan Center for Justice, talking about whether or not the clerk in Houston could send out absentee ballot applications to every voter. Another case involving drop boxes and making them accessible in a place like Harris County, which is huge. So there are practical things to do. There's also, the advocacy we've already talked about at the federal level for legislation. There's also something that we touched on earlier, which is what's going on online and the importance of monitoring, reporting, countering the disinformation, the misinformation that's circulating, the things, for anybody who was paying attention, January 6th should not have been a huge surprise, because there was all this stuff circulating online on major platforms, on Facebook and on Twitter and elsewhere. And Cindy, you mentioned the Stop Hate for Profit campaign. This is another a variation of that same theme, but the way the extremists and political activists have used the online platforms to spread this misinformation, disinformation. It's hard enough with the restrictions that are being placed legally on things like absentee ballots and what's going on in Texas now. I assume we'll at some point get to the new bill that's working its way through the Texas legislature that is absolutely awful. But with all the restrictions that are being placed, the fact that combined with misinformation about what you still can do is really poisonous. And I think all of us working together, and this is not an issue where ADL pretends to be in the lead. We hugely respect the efforts of groups like Voters Committee for Civil Rights Under Law and Common Cause and League of Women Voters, ACLU, LULAC and NAACP and others, Brennan Center in this space. But I agree wholeheartedly that joining together, elevating each other's voices, making sure people know what rights are still out there, what you still can do, is just as important as fighting to push back on the efforts to restrict that.
Right.
Gracias, Steve. Gabriela?
Kind of hard to follow these two. I would add that, I want to elevate a couple of points. On the disinformation piece, I think, Derek, you mentioned foreign policy related to the Jewish community, but in the Latino community, this last election cycle, it was really problematic, especially in areas with more newly arrived immigration patterns, Florida, for example. And what we were seeing down there was a lot of information coming from South America into the Latino community that was confusing. And from our end, doing the work on the ground, thinking specifically of Mi Familia Vota, there was this constant need to be aware of what was being stated and then stay really focused on what we were trying to accomplish, to Steve's point, which is to ensure that the disinformation about the process did not marry together with the disinformation about the candidates, right? And just to keep it really centered and focused. And sadly, that means the need for additional resources. And our communities are already undervalued and are already underfunded. So when these processes come in via, the internet, which is great because it also is a great way to share information that is good or correct, maybe instead of giving it a value. You're constantly playing catch up. So we have to get better at unitedly hanging tough, but also pushing forth a more thoughtful common message that kind of not just debunks the disinformation, but almost makes it, like that, oh, we don't do that, that's not cool, right? Like give it a sort of a local colloquial feel to it. And Terry, you raised something that I think is really critical to think about as well, which comes into play, which is this concept of communities of interest. I've been, again, I'm not a legal scholar, but in my efforts here in Maryland, for example, I'm actually studying ag sector groups because they've been split and divided in pieces in special elections, because to learn from the process that they went through to try and stay together, so that as this nascent Latino community and Asian community too, you guys are up by, I think, the 7% of the population now, that when we come together with the African American community, that we're all sort of like, well, together we're a community of interest, and we may not quite be, majority minority, but we're still a significant factor, and we're still, connected, and we share similar challenges that require that our legislators listen to us, because otherwise, I think, Terry, you also said this, that they kind of pass the buck to the other district. So, that's just kind of making it real.
I like that, because when you think about the tools that's being used against us, it is all about narrative and information. Social media platforms are like super spreaders. Once you get on that highway, it just goes. And the pattern that I've been noticing, particularly over the last 10 years or so, was the level of trying to breed xenophobia within community. Xenophobia, African against Africans, right? Well, if you're not a descendant of slavery, therefore you're not entitled, you should be part of the conversation. The dumbest thing I've ever heard, right? Or, if you're along the Texas border, those who are indigenous Texans who are Mexican heritage, pushing back against those who are migrating over. Or, so it is always the seeds of division. It's very intentional. That's what I'm saying. They're trying to get us to pick us off on the fringes. When we filed the DACA lawsuit, I had members say, why are you filing a DACA lawsuit? That has nothing to do with us. And then I said, do you know this person who's a member next to you? You do realize they're from the Dominican Republic, but they're members of the Naacp. Or this person over here is Nigerian, member of the Naacp. They're going to be impacted by this decision. It's not about one community. It's about all of our communities. And so that's that picking us on the fringes with xenophobia. I am clear. If a synagogue is terrorized, then it's a Black church next.
Sure.
If a Black church is issue that's taking place there, it's a Latino community next. Because the goal isn't about the caste system. The caste system is the control mechanism they put in place. The goal is to maintain domination and control of the flow of resources and the control of the natural resources. And as long as we are distracted, they can continue to kill the planet, exploit the tax dollars, and do all the things that none of our communities would like to see. And that's the shared interest that we have to lean into as we fight against the narratives of splitting us up on the fringes.
That's right.
Absolutely, Derek. And I would just ask and add, as you do this work, and I know that the NAACP has chapters across the country, you're present in every state. What are you hearing from your members in terms of the misconceptions in your own community and our community when it comes to voting and accessing our voting booth?
Well, it depends on the state, right? So we're in 47 states. So if y'all have anybody who want to join in Montana, Idaho, and South Dakota, let us know. But But it all depends on the state. The reality of how things are playing out in a deep southern state like Alabama is different in Utah. Our membership in Utah is so diverse, you think it's United Nations, right? So it all depends on the state, but the goal has consistently been how to marginalize the emerging communities that will be the voices of the majority. And that has been the consistent drumbeat. And the tools that are being used are around the narratives of hate and of division. And that's why the partnership with LULAC, ADL will Stop Hate for Profit, because that's the center of the reality. When you see a march in Charlottesville, Virginia, with people carrying tiki torches, bone and skull, that is Nazism at its lowest common denominator.
That's right.
That's a threat to all of us. And so we have to be as focused as putting everybody to the center of gravity of morality, the center of gravity of collective interest, that we all have a common interest of pushing back against the white supremacist presence that's there because they will use us against each other so they can suppress all of us.
That's right.
And I know, Steve, you've been trying to jump in, so I'm going to shift over to you, and then I'm going to go to you, Irasema.
Thank you.
I just want to say what Derek said.
Me too. One point specifically about what Derek said, and then sort of a jumping off to another point related to the voting rights. So 100% agree. And it's true in terms of fighting discrimination. It's true in terms of fighting hate crimes. It's true in terms of fighting hate online. We've learned through the years that you can't just have a discrimination law that protects against discrimination against Blacks or against Jews or against Latinos. You have to have a law that protects against marginalized communities and speaks broadly if you want it to pass, if you want it to be constitutionally sound, if you want to get public support for it. The same is true for the advocacy work we do on hate crimes and on hate online. But and that's been ADL's sort of watchword through all the years. From the beginning when we started working on these issues, we realized that we need to do it in partnership. But I would say in terms of voting, one of the things that's particularly important to emphasize, and we've emphasized this in our work through last year and before, is that when we talk about the right to vote and we talk about access to the polls and we talk about early voting and we talk about absentee ballots, we're not telling people how to vote. And this benefits everybody, right? One of the key points to emphasize when you're talking about voting rights is you vote for whoever you want to vote for. It shouldn't be there shouldn't be artificial limits on accessing this basic right to the ballot box. And we made a point of saying this in the advocacy we did in Texas last year. When we're talking about making it easier to vote to use a drop box, that impacted all different kinds of communities in Harris County. That did not just impact marginalized communities. And in fact, if you look at the data, and I haven't delved into it in great detail, but I know that there are as many Republicans as Democrats who have taken advantage of early voting and have taken advantage of mail-in voting. And that often gets lost, that people portray this as a political desire to elevate one party at the expense of the other, and overlook the fact that these are practices in many states that really, it's not like early voting for Democrats. It's early voting for any registered voter.
That's right.
And that's a really important point to emphasize in our advocacy.
Gracias, Steve. And Irasema, I know that you've been waiting to jump in, so I'm going to shift it over to you.
No, actually, I think that everything is been covered. But one of the things that I've seen when I've done voter protection in the last few cycles, go out to states and help out with that sort of thing. And one of the things that I was seeing on the ground, and I don't know about other people, but I happened to be in Nevada in one of the cycles. And it was really scary for communities of color because people would show up with rifles as big as I was, because you can carry that way. And it was amazing how later, the community on this, I was also like staffing a Spanish language line where the community was scared to go out there and trying to figure out, like, when is it that you think I can vote that these guns are not going to be there? I mean, these were the types of calls that we were getting. And that I think, I don't even know how to address that, but that was something that I think we're going to see more of, right? Because there's this whole thing about undocumented people voting and, it's fraudulent and all of that, which we all know that it is absolutely not true. So those are the things that I've seen when I've done work on the ground.
I think one specific response, there is actually a bill pending now that Representative Ruiz from California introduced called the Vote Without Fear Act, which specifically deals with guns in polling places. And if that's a major concern, that's definitely something worth encouraging people to support. And I think it is
a concern in Latino communities, and probably African-American communities as well, right? When the sheriff shows up and they're kind of out there and they've got guns and all of that. I mean, who wants to stand in line and be subjected to that? That is very scary. And talk about voter suppression.
Yeah, there's also a concern about poll watchers and expanding the rights of poll watchers to do more than just stand and watch, but actually become who's going to protect the voters from aggressive actions by poll watchers. The way the trend of some of these laws now we're seeing is rather scary.
No, thank you, Steve, and thank you so much for this discussion. And I would just add that think to Derek's point, when we look at hate crimes, there has been a significant increase in hate crimes across all communities, whether it's our African American community, our transgender community, our Latino community, our Jewish community. We're seeing our Asian American community, we're seeing anti-Semitism, we're seeing our Asian community being directly hit, as we saw in Georgia, and in other instances, being knocked down on the ground, simply walking down the street where they live. And so, I do want to raise that point. And then, also ask each of you, because we have so many LULAC members and also general audiences who are tuning in for the first time. Last year, we were able to hit a record 300,000 views plus. So we know that there's individuals out there that question, well, why vote? Does my vote matter? And I'm going to ask each of you to do like the 1-minute plug of like why your vote matters and why you should absolutely be registering to vote and turning out to vote. So I'm going to start off with you, Gabriela, then we'll shift over to Terry, up to Iracema, and then we'll end with Steve and Derek.
I think our vote, well, I'm passionate about it. I'm kind of crazy. I get really happy when I vote, but that aside, I feel so strongly it's our first way of really expressing our civic participation and our responsibility as a citizen of the country. And I think that's where the joy for me comes out. But there's also another really great part to it, which is when you get legislators and elected local officials in place who really care about you, they're going to care about your issues. And it would be ideal if they looked like us. But if they don't, at least that they really understand our communities and are embracing us, and that we're voting for them because we believe in them. Because at the end of the day, especially in the United States, it's so tied to dollars, and the dollars that are going to get down into those localities to address the challenges that we're all facing, whether it's in education. I think, Iracema, you were talking about the poverty levels and those socioeconomic factors, because those sociodeterminants are there for everything. If we can address those pieces, then the chances of having representation in other areas like public health, especially now as I think about the pandemic, it becomes more important, because then more resources are put in place and the likelihood to have materials that are bilingual, everything changes. It really makes a difference.
Yeah.
Gracias, Gabriela. Terry?
Sure, and I'm going to piggyback on that wonderful response and to say, those are all good reasons why we need to vote, why we should be voting. And I would add, and also voting for those who don't have the opportunity to vote yet.
That's right.
Whether that's because they're not naturalized yet, because they're children and they can't vote yet. It's also important for us to make sure that we're voting for our communities and for those who don't have that ability, because our vote is our voice. And if we vote on behalf of our community, then it's not just our voice, it's our community's voice. And then that leads to, as Gabriela mentioned, having elected officials that represent our needs, our communities, and will be responsive and will make sure that whether it's the dollars, whether it's policy solutions that are meant to address particular concerns and issues, will make sure that our communities are a part of the solution rather than being continually left behind, so that we become more and more marginalized rather than being a part of the fabric and the infrastructure of our communities.
Gracias, Terry. Iracema?
Everything Gabby said, everything that Terry said. And what I always tell people is to look at certain elections. I don't have one in mind right now, where just a number of votes absolutely made the difference one way or the other. So does it matter? Absolutely. And I always tell people, voting is a responsibility. If you live in this society, it's a responsibility. And, if you don't vote, then you don't have an opinion later to complain about X, Y, or Z. So su voto es su voz.
Gracias. Steve?
I agree with everything everybody has said. I think voting is fundamental to all the other rights that we have. That's how we protect other rights, is by participating in the democracy. There's a Thomas Jefferson quote about voting that I happen to like. He said, "We do not have government by the majority, we have government by the majority who participate." And I think, in a time when Jefferson said it, of course, there were many who couldn't participate. But now, today, when we've opened the doors in terms of voting rights to make sure that every citizen can vote, it's really a priority to make sure people exercise that franchise, understand it's important.
Gracias. Derek?
I mean, that part what Steve said, those who participate. And every time I go to a convenience store, get gas, there are taxes taken out of my purchase. Those taxes represent my ownership stake, my contribution to government. That I am a owner of government. I should not be a victim of government. And the only way for us not to be victims of government, the governments that we own, is through our participation. And it's through our participation that we can define the guardrails of safety for our communities. We can define the quality of life for our young people. We can define the type of care we would like to see handed to the elders and seniors in our communities. We can define how those who are the forgotten, the disabled, those with disabilities could be treated in a humane way. Because we are owners of government, we should not ever be seen as victims of government. And then secondly, growing up in Detroit, I remember when the news came across about Vincent Chin. Vincent Chin was an Asian American who was simply going to enjoy life. Nothing special, just a good guy. But because working class whites seeing themselves at a level of privilege as a result of the auto industry shutting down, they took them to be Japanese, because at that time they were saying the Japanese are taking our jobs, they're taking the cars. Mm-hmm. And they took a privilege that they should not have to take his life. Mm-hmm. We must vote so we can protect the future Vincent Chins of the world. Mm-hmm. So that the guardrails of safety for our communities, that there are no other synagogues and Pittsburghs that are destroyed or defecated. There are no more Latino communities who are worried about children being separated at the border, or your child being mistaken for not being a citizen, although your child is a citizen, or an African American being treated less than a human being. We must vote because we are owners of this government, and none of our communities should ever be victims of this government, and victims because this government is refusing to protect our communities and our future realities.
Derek, I just want to say I will vote for you. I don't care what you run for. You have my vote.
Which is a plug here, run for office, right? So like, you must turn out to vote, and at
Derek,
some point also run for office.
No. Then I'll start cussing more. You don't want me to cuss more.
Gracias, Derek. Y lo que yo diría en español es que para esas personas que están pensando que su voto no cuenta, quiero que tomen un momento para reflexionar que si su voto no contara, entonces no habrían todas estas instituciones, personas tratando de quitarles ese derecho. And, for folks who are tuning in, I also just want us to think and pause about the fact that if your vote did not count, there would not be these strategies and individuals trying to take away your right to vote, right? Like, these are things that have been happening. Think thoughtfully about, one, the growing communities that we have in the Asian American community, the Latino community, the African American community, and what that means for the future of this country. I just think, one, the census number, Iracema, and you brought that up, today Latinos are 60 million strong, and in just 3 decades, Latinos will be close to 120 million strong, which means that in the context of America, 1 in 3 Americans will be of Latino ancestry. And so, I want us to continue to push a little bit on this, but we're going to shift into the midterms. And I'm just wondering, as you're working through your organizations and through your networks, what are the concerns and the opportunities that you see as we head into the midterms? So we're going to go in backward order this time, and we'll start off with Derek and then go to Steve.
I missed that completely. I'm sorry.
No worries, Derek. And so we're talking about opportunities and concerns as we head into the midterms, and we're kicking it off with you.
So opportunities, when you look at states like Texas and Georgia and many other states, the opportunity is really to make history. With historic turnout, with very focused community engagement and organizing. I'm nonpartisan. I'm not suggesting anyone should vote a particular way, but I am political in terms of those who show up to allow their voices to be heard will be the voices that's heard if we do it strategically, collectively, and have impact. that we define what's really in our common interest and make sure that those who get elected to represent that interest truly represent our needs and concerns. That in Texas, you have a bigger footprint than anyone else in Texas, LULAC. And the reality of what you're able to do in that state would define America's future. And that's so important. It would define America's future. And I'm not suggesting one candidate is better than the other, but you can keep Ted Cruz at home. I'm not telling anybody how to vote for anybody, right? You can do something that's so profound that it will create the nexus to make sure that all of our communities are safe, to make sure that our young people can have a prosperous future. That's the opportunity here. The concerns are those who are trying to suffocate the pipeline to democracy by isolating and eliminating avenues where people can participate, whether it's mail-in ballots or drop box, that we must fight as hard as possible to stop that. I am so glad the members of the Texas House of Representatives left so they wouldn't have the quorum. And it's hard on them. I mean, the sacrifice they're making is tremendous. Cindy and I joined the call about a week ago to try to figure out if there's anything we could do. Could we shift the burden off the House members to the Senate? But at the end of the day, the messages that they are sending, and these are progressives-minded people who care about the state of Texas, white, Latino, Black, all coming together, male, female, to make a statement. So let's not let them down and turn out next year in record numbers.
Mm-hmm.
Steve?
I agree. Seems like I'm always agreeing with Derek, which I'm honored to do. I would come at this with a little bit of a different perspective in terms of concerns. I think concern about misinformation and disinformation is still there and as serious as ever. And I think one of the most important messages we can convey to people, if they're seeing stuff online, if they're seeing rumors about mail-in voting or about early voting, what they can do, what they can't do, they should be encouraged to turn to reliable sources. They should do critical thinking. They should look to LULAC. They should look to the NAACP. They should look to ABL. They should look to other organizations, that are known, respected in their community, or more broadly, groups like some of those I've mentioned before, and just not believe something just because they saw it on Facebook or because they saw it on Twitter or because somebody told them that they saw it on Facebook or Twitter, or in the case particularly, I think of the Latinx community, that somebody in another country saw something and related to them and said, "What do you know about this? This is pretty scary." I think there are a lot of efforts. Texas is particularly noteworthy in making it harder to vote, but there's also a lot of misinformation and people being told they can't do things that in fact they still probably could do. So one of the important lessons, agreeing with the importance of doing it, one of the important lessons is don't believe everything somebody tells you. Don't believe everything some read about. You can't do this, you can't do that. Check it out for yourself. Talk to a reliable authority, whether it's the Secretary of State's office or the Board of Elections or an organization you trust, and see if in fact you can confirm or the opposite, what you're hearing, and just know your rights. I think is as important as any other message we could convey.
Thank you, Steve. Why don't we go next to you, Irisema, and then we'll come over to Terry and wrap it up with Gabriela.
So everything that they have said, but the numbers, if we started out with the census, Cindy, the growth in the Latino population and Asian population cannot be overstated. In states like Texas and California, 1 out of every 2 kids is Latino. There's 1 million Latinos turning 18 every single day. Though we need to obviously work as hard as we can to register those Latinos to vote. And I know Mi Familia Vota does a tremendous job, Gabby, in getting out and registering people, LULAC and others. So I think that that's a great opportunity, as Derek said, because, we can change sort of the face of Texas and some of these other states. At the same time, the threat is the fact that our communities are growing, and it's scaring, right? Those people that are in power, they're concerned that the face of America is changing and will continue to change. And because of that, we will continue to have challenges that we have to overcome with the strategies that Steve just shared with us and that Derek just shared with us as well.
Gracias, Irisema. Before turning over to Terry, for the folks who are on social media, every 30 seconds, a Latino in the US is turning 18, which means that every single year for the next 10 years, close to 1 million Latinos will be turning 18 and will be eligible to register to vote.
Yep.
Every 30 seconds. Harry.
So continuing on the numbers game, I would just share that, yes, Asian Americans remain one of the fastest growing communities. I think over the last decade, Asian Americans were the fastest growing group. Every state saw growth in their Asian American population. What people might not realize is that the three fastest growing states were actually North and South Dakota and Nebraska, which to me just indicates that we are growing everywhere. But we still see that some of the longstanding states with the traditional gateway city states, such as California and New York, remain the largest Asian American populations. But what might not be known is that Texas actually last decade overtook Hawaii as the third largest Asian American population. And certainly with the most recent release of the redistricting data from the Census Bureau, the legacy file format shows that Texas is the 10th fastest growing Asian American community and the third largest. So I think that that is a great opportunity, as has been mentioned. But for me, I think the concerns are twofold. One is, of course, just the general issues overall with respect to engaging our communities, particularly to participate in midterms, right? We all know usually there's a dip in participation for midterm overall, and then even more so for our communities. So that's one piece where we will have to make sure that we are putting out fires when it comes to mis and disinformation, that we're putting out quality educational information, but also the motivational reasons why people need to participate, because folks are still going to be worrying about healthcare, about pandemic, childcare, education, all these types of things that oftentimes in the day-to-day can seem more urgent, right? And needing that care. And so I think, and I apologize because I forgot who made the wonderful point earlier, but really that our votes underline, right, those types of policy decisions. So if we can help make those connections, that'll be really important. The other thing I would say that remains a concern is, we discussed today already the horrific Supreme Court decision in Shelby County v. Holder that ineffectuated, right, the Section 5 preclearance provision of the Voting Rights Act. And that certainly was devastating. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court was at it again this year, right? And in their Brnovich versus DNC decision, July 1st, I think really struck another blow to the efficacy of the Voting Rights Act. Of course, we don't know exactly how that's all going to play out, but we do know that they've made things more complicated. And they have, I have put things into even more potential chaos with respect to the litigation that's already happening because of the voter suppression, the onslaught of voter suppression bills that we've been seeing, but also what's likely to come with the midterm election and the litigation that always surrounds these types of, elections, high stakes elections. We don't know exactly how that's all going to play out. The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act does have a response to that, does have a legislative fix to both the Shelby County v. Holder decision and the Brnovich decision. So I think that is certainly for Advancing Justice AHAC, one of our top priorities to get that bill passed.
Gracias, Terry. Gabriela.
So I agree with everybody, of course. But I think as I listen to all of you, what really strikes me, what we're really talking about is about power, right? Who gets to wield power and what is our role in getting access? And that demands that in the midterms, especially, we not think just because we voted in the presidential, we don't have more duty. And I would even go even deeper into the local races, which really have very, very low turnouts, right? But that's really literally where the rubber hits the road for us as communities. So I just want us to reflect on that, because power, I believe someone said once, power is never given away. You have to grab it. You have to take it. And when we work together in these united fronts, going back to the redistricting point, because it's all tied together, right? This is a holistic process, but it's complicated and there's a lot of different pieces. And staying on top of all that information is challenging. So I thank all of you who are, doing this really heavy lifting, because you're helping the rest of us be able to educate the people on the ground so that we not only ensure that they get the information that they need, but we're also encouraging them. We are showing them that as they vote, they're part of something. They're part of something much bigger. And they are taking that responsibility, as Iracema said, to participate and to put in their 2 cents, right? Everybody brings their little grain of sand. Todos traemos nuestro granito de arena. And that's how we're going to build a better democracy. And again, someone mentioned January 6th. I think that was you, Steve. That was no surprise. If we had read all those things, we knew something was going to happen. We just didn't know exactly when. And the challenge is moving forward. Those fires have not been dissipated. So it's incumbent upon us to participate and ser parte de algo mucho más grande para tener una democracia que fluye. Much bigger, that we have a democracy that flows.
Gracias, Gabriela. And I know, Derek, that you might be dropping off, but before you do, I did want to ask you about allyship and the moment that we're living in today, 2021, having passed and not passed, but having experienced and witnessed Black Lives Matter, having witnessed and experienced the increase in hate crimes, having experienced and witnessed all the tactics that are being used against our communities of color. Derek, how can we be better allies?
We're showing up. I think what we've seen last summer looked like America. There were people taken to the streets, peaceful demonstration under a value proposition of Black Lives Matter. It's not about a group or hashtag, it's a value proposition. Showing up when we've seen the increase in hate crime against the Asian community and supporting legislation for anti-Asian hate. Showing up when the synagogue is defecated in Pittsburgh, people showing up to say, this is not who we are. Showing up, speaking out against children being pulled away from parents at the border, or recognizing that every human being should be treated with human dignity. So just showing up and being strategic. Public policy is the outcome, and that public policy must reflect our needs and interests.
That's right.
It is not the performative activity of a demonstration only, or statements of condolences or support. It is about pushing together to shape a public policy frame that allow the Constitution to have life breathed into it, and it's reflective of the diversity of who we are. This country's future is much more diverse than its past. And by only looking at the past, we will only get past bad activity. But if we look toward the future, we would have a more inclusive democracy. It's showing up.
Eric, 2022.
No?
Terry, why don't you jump in and talk about allyship and how we can be better allies in this moment?
Sure. Certainly, everything that President Johnson discussed, completely wholeheartedly support. And I think for me, one of the major lessons of doing this work has been, the relationship building is so critical, right? Showing up is much easier when you have that relationship built, right? When you had that trust built, that ability not to automatically jump or assume ill intentions or, bad actions, but really to pause for a moment if something happens, because things happen, right? We're not always going to agree 100%. But when you have those relationships, when you have that trust built, pause and say, you know what? Hey, look, this happened. What's up with that? Rather than making, assumptions, then accusations, and then allowing for the division, as President Johnson discussed earlier, to occur, right? We've seen that certainly from the policy side, where people do try to peel us off from one another. Certainly Asian Americans have seen being used as a wedge group on certain issues and the like, as I'm sure every community has had that experience of, people trying to use them as the wedge. And so it's harder to do that when we all already have these relationships and are working together in a real sense, not just in that performative sense, like, oh, we just, online we'll show up with you, or like in the streets we'll show up with you, but really in the back room, behind the scenes, where there's no credit, where there's no glamour, there's no glory, but doing the actual work. When you're doing it together, then that's how we're able to manifest the results that we want. And so I think that it is a critical piece to how we all get the America that we all dream of and deserve, by using the numbers that we're seeing, but then creating the relationships and the trust amongst one another to be able to then push forward a better future.
Gracias, Terry. Gabriela?
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, she's right. It's the issue of the working behind the scenes together. I think I learn more from doing that work than I do from anything else. And building allyships is critical. Again, I mean, my work isn't national, it's regional, right? I'm in the Mid-Atlantic. And really, if it weren't for allyships, I would be very hard to do what I'm trying to accomplish, right? And I think, in a place like Texas, there's places specifically like in Harris County and Houston specifically, more narrowly, where you really see a confluence of communities already in a process where the gerrymandering is trying to divide them up so that they are not as effective. Every time they're effective, somebody tries to split them up, right? And that's, hopefully we in the Mid-Atlantic can get ahead of the curve, although Maryland is a highly gerrymandered state, right? So, but that's political. So how then, again, through allyship, do we build these communities of interest and partnerships for everything from addressing food insecurity to, getting kids into university, and then, ensuring, I mean, like the laundry list is long. Every issue has the potential. And without allyship, I don't think we're going to get to a better place. Because at the end of the day, when we talk about diversity and we talk about multiculturalism in America, we are America, right? And only when we work together are we able to change a narrative that is not correct any longer, right? And we have to build those cultural changes.
Gracias, Gabriela. Steve and Iracema, would you like to jump in?
I was just going to say like three things that I was like reflecting on right now. I'm looking at the communities that are represented here, and everybody has experienced violence. We can't forget El Paso.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, that was a massacre of Latinos for being Latinos. So every community, and that's why I think when we see me as a Latina, something happening in the African American community, Jewish community, or Asian community, like I feel it, because I know that we've gone through that. So that should sort of like bring a unity. My whole thing has always been there's power in numbers, right? And if we let people divide us, which is sort of, as Derek said a while ago, that is sort of the goal, then we all lose, right? So I think that and that as communities that are going through this, that are challenging, I think that our academic thinking is absolutely great, and we have to analyze and think through this. But in the name of, the iconic civil rights leader, John Lewis, sometimes we have to get into good trouble. We have to get some good trouble to make sure that we're able to change the needle, to move the needle.
I echo everything everybody said about the importance of allyship, the importance of relationship building. The whole is bigger than the sum of the parts. The one thing I would add is the power of it. Because, for example, when there's an anti-Semitic incident and ADL speaks out against it, people say, of course, the ADL is going to do that. When somebody else in the Latino community or the Black community or the Asian community or the Muslim community speaks out against the synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh or an anti-Semitic incident, people go, oh, wow.
Yes.
And the same is true when there was a rash of anti-Asian crimes, I think,
Right.
and other groups came up and said, this is not acceptable. That, or anti-trans and other groups come in, or anti-Black and other groups come in, or anti-Latino. There is a power in other groups saying, it's not just these predictable, usual suspects complaining here, it's everybody together saying this is not acceptable. And the power of that message is so much greater than the power of us just saying it by ourselves. So that just reinforces to me what the message here is about, how critical working together is.
Gracias, Steve. And as we come to the end of the panel, I'm going to close it out with this question. And I know that we're getting a couple of messages because we've referenced For the People Act and the John Lewis Act. And so why don't we go with you, Steve? And what I'm going to ask the panelists to do is, why does the For the People Act matter? What does it include that will change and improve voting access for our communities? And what are your concluding remarks when it comes to next steps? So if you're speaking to our LULAC members, to the general audience, individuals that maybe for the first time are thinking of getting involved, what would be your recommendation as we head into the midterms? And Steve, why don't we start with you?
Okay. Thanks. And thanks again for letting me be part of this. So the For the People Act, very quickly, has a whole bunch of provisions that would mandate early voting, no excuse vote by mail, automatic voter registration, redistricting reform, campaign finance reform. It's sort of a grab bag of different ideas that people have had to make voting easier, more efficient, more effective. And obviously, given the patchwork we're seeing in different states where there are efforts to try to restrict it, I think if we could ever get it passed, it would be a huge victory for all Americans. And I think that the John Lewis Act, equally as important, would restore the power of the Voting Rights Act by letting the Justice Department respond to efforts to restrict or limit the right to vote. And I would just end with a note saying, basically echoing what we've said so far, I think the main message is here that there is no more important right in a democracy than the right to vote. It's not something that people should take for granted. It's not something people should assume my vote isn't going to count. We've seen close elections where every vote counts. And it really is a responsibility, I think, of all of us as Americans, regardless of our ethnicity or religion or anything else, to exercise the franchise whenever we have the chance.
Gracias, Steve. Derek?
I'm slowly trying to figure out how do we get to the end goal. The end goal is getting 50 members in the Senate to pass protection around our right to vote for midterm elections, to ensure that we reauthorize the Voting Rights Act. So I've stepped away from the titles and more focused on the outcome. And so the John Lewis Act, I am absolutely in support of, but once it gets to the Senate, can we get the 50 votes necessary? I am absolutely in support of what was in the For the People Act. But once we get to the Senate, can we get the 50 votes that's needed for passage? And so I'm more focused on an outcome around ensuring that we expand access to voting through early voting and mail-in voting, and that we're not intimidated when we get to the polls, to reauthorize the Voting Rights Act, and to do so before the midterm elections, and to ensure that political or racial gerrymandering around political boundary lines will not be the standard. Now, in this political process, there's a lot of friction going on. And people say, well, we got to do away with the filibuster. It has to be filibuster proof. I am convinced that we will never get 10 Republicans to support voting right protections in this Congress. If we can only get 7 of them to vote to investigate an insurrection, an act of treason, we would never get 10 of them to support making sure that democracy is afforded to everyone, because it's not in their political interest. And so our push will be to make sure voting protections are moved forward. And if it only requires 50 votes, there should not be a discussion around an antiquated segregationist procedural rule, because the substance of our Constitution, the right to vote, should be the only thing that matters. And so that's what we're focusing on.
Gracias, Derek. Terry?
So I would say my fellow panelists have covered the For the People Act fairly well. So I'm going to hone in on one provision around the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act that we've been working on in conjunction with MALDEF in particular, because not only were we looking to restore the Voting Rights Act post Shelby County v. Holder, and then, of course, addressing the Brnovich decision when it came out recently, but also really to address the fact that the previous functionality of preclearance really did not necessarily address the needs of new emerging communities, right? Which is something that was particularly relevant for Asian American communities and for Latino communities who are, also expanding into other not normally thought of states, with growth. And that really is this idea of a practice-based preclearance. That is a part of the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And in a nutshell, what that provision looks at is really certain practices that have historically been used to silence the political voice of a growing, emerging political power or community of color, and looking at making those practices in certain diverse jurisdictions. Those practices would have to be pre-cleared by a preclearance process similar to what we know, rather than looking at specific jurisdictions. And so that is something that is currently in the bill, and that we are very eager to, continue to help build the record on, and help to support as a complement to the outstanding other provisions of the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And really, all of that is to say that there is something to help improve the voting rights of all Americans. And so everybody should be engaged in that. And in the immediate future, I would say next up, please get involved in your redistricting process. It's somewhat not related, but also related to the extent that you could be electing people that could be voting on bills such as these. And it's happening right now.
That's right.
Gracias, Terry. Iracema, and we'll finish it off with you, Gabriela.
So, I think they've covered the acts, pretty well. We need legislation. We need this legislation to restore to be able to protect some of the rights that we had before, Shelby came into being, that Supreme Court decision that took away some of the protections under the Voting Rights Act. But what I'd like to do then is just, tell my, mi gente Latina, right, that are here, is that, we have not only the right to vote, right, but this is a responsibility. And just, I think that in the upcoming elections and everything, we need to always, start from the premise that this is our country. There is this thinking out there that somehow Latinos are all immigrants, when in fact, right, there's like 80% of Latinos are U.S. citizens, either by birth or because they've been naturalized. Kids that are 18 and under in the Latino community, it's like 97% are citizens of this country. This is our country, and we have a responsibility to vote and elect people that are going to enact policies, right, that promote and advance the interests of our communities. So
Gracias,
thank you so much.
Iracema. Gracias. Gabriela.
I'll defer the legalities of the For the People Act to our scholars who've spoken already. But I would add this, and for me, the act of voting is kind of sacred, right? It's personal. It's really what you believe is, and that's what you're trying to translate in the act, right? In voting. And when I think about all of the processes and how they fit together, both of these two acts are going to make a huge difference. And to Terry's point, when we vote for somebody who supports us, hopefully they will be supporting this type of legislation and these principles of what we believe, we the people believe, are the principles of democracy, right? But we have to protect it, and we have to remain vigilant. And that's part of the voting process, is you're being vigilant. You're ensuring that the process remains yours, really, that you have ownership of it. And so, recognizing that it's very personal, recognizing that there's a lot on the table, our very, if not our survival, our ability to thrive, then yes, it is a responsibility. And so therefore, I will continue to encourage everyone I can, educate everybody I can, share information from reliable resources to everybody I can, because it really is that important and it matters that much.
Muchísimas gracias, Gabriela. And thank you so much, Iracema, to Derek, Terry, Steve, and Gabriela for your time today. As we close out this panel, I want to make sure that we are reminded that LULAC has always been a part of our community for over 92 years. And for 92 years, we have protected, defended, and advanced the agenda of the Latino community. Today, we continue to protect voting rights, whether it's in Florida, whether it's in Texas or Iowa, through litigation. LULAC has lawsuits across the country to make sure that our rights are protected. And to close it out with a recap of what I have heard from all the panelists, it is our voice, it is our vote, it is our right. And it's up to us to make sure that we are engaged and that we are participating to make sure that our country continues to change and continues to reflect our diversity. Con eso, muchísimas gracias por estar con nosotros. Thank you.